The pond had been dying for 30 years. Not dramatically, not in the way that commands attention, the way that things die on the back end of a farm when a man has too many other things requiring his attention, and a silting pond ranks below everything else on the list. It had been a good pond once, half an acre, 12 feet at the deep end, stocked with bass and bluegill by the previous owner in the early 1970s. By the time Roy Casper inherited the property from his uncle in 1997, it was already shallow and weedy. By the time Roy retired from grain farming in 2019, it was 8 feet at the deepest point, filling progressively with the silt that a decades-long absence of dredging produces, and the far bank had slumped in a way that suggested the ground beneath it had been unstable for some time. Roy had decided to drain it in the spring of his 68th year, the point at which a man who has farmed 41 years either finds something to occupy his hands or begins to deteriorate. He was going to drain the pond, clean the basin, repair the far bank, and restock it. It would take the better part of a summer. He had the summer. What he did not have was the right equipment. The job required a tractor with sufficient hydraulic capacity to run a high-volume trash pump through the PTO across several days of continuous operation. Roy's remaining equipment after retiring was modest, a small utility tractor suited to property maintenance, not to driving a serious pump for days at a stretch. He needed something older, heavier, simpler, something he could run hard without worrying about it. He found it in April at a farm sale 20 miles north in Jefferson County. A Massey Ferguson 35, 1962, two-wheel drive, the diesel variant, a machine that had been sitting in a shed since the previous owner had stopped using it in the late 1990s. It started at the sale with a shot of ether and ran with the particular rattling confidence of an old diesel that has been dormant but not destroyed. The hydraulics worked. The PTO engaged. The sheet metal was rough and one rear fender was missing entirely, but the frame was straight and the tires held air, and the engine produced the steady low-end torque that a trash pump on a long drainage job requires. Roy paid $1,800 for it. He drove it home on the county road at the machine's top speed of 14 miles per hour, which took 40 minutes and which he did not mind at all. He set up the pump on the south bank of the pond on a Monday morning in early May. He primed the suction line, engaged the PTO, and watched the discharge begin to flow into the drainage ditch that ran along the east edge of the back 40 toward a low tile outlet. The water was dark with suspended silt. The pump moved it steadily. Roy set a lawn chair on the bank and watched for the first hour, adjusting the suction line depth twice as the level began to drop, then went back to the house for coffee and returned to check it every hour through the morning. By afternoon, the water level had dropped approximately 18 inches. The near bank's toe was beginning to emerge from the water, gray-brown with the particular clay that underlies that part of Jefferson County at any depth below the topsoil. Roy noted the drop, checked the pump, confirmed the suction line had not clogged on the debris that was concentrating as the volume decreased, and went back to the house for supper. The following morning, the level had dropped another 14 inches overnight. Roy could see the bottom in the shallower areas near the inlet, exposed mud with the texture of wet concrete and the smell of decades of decomposition. He checked the pump. He moved the suction line. He resumed his hourly checks. It was on the third day, in the early afternoon, when the water had dropped to the point where the center of the pond was showing perhaps 3 feet of depth over its lowest point, that Roy saw something in the mud of the far bank that did not belong there. He saw it first as a shape, a regularity in the slumped bank that was inconsistent with the natural profile of eroded clay, a straight line where natural erosion does not produce straight lines. A corner angle at a depth of perhaps 2 feet below the original waterline, now partially exposed as the level continued to fall. He stood on the south bank and looked at it for a long time. Then he walked around to the far bank through the knee-high grass and crouched at the water's edge. What he was looking at was metal. Specifically, it was the front axle assembly and partial hood section of a tractor, buried nose first in the bank at an angle that suggested the machine had entered the water from the bank above and sunk forward into the silt over many years, until the bank had effectively incorporated it. The metal was rusted to the particular deep orange-brown that ferrous metal achieves after decades of submersion in oxygenated water. The rubber on the front tires, what remained of it, had deteriorated to a crumbling material that no longer resembled tire rubber. But the axle casting was intact. The hood, or what remained of it, retained enough of its original profile to be recognizable as agricultural equipment from the pre-cab era. Roy looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he went back to the house, called his neighbor Dale Pritchard, who had a backhoe, and asked if Dale could come over in the next day or two for a job that required explanation in person. Dale said he could come Thursday. Roy said Thursday was fine. He did not tell anyone else. Not because he had a reason for secrecy, because he was a man who did not speak about things until he understood them, and he did not yet understand what he was looking at. Dale arrived Thursday morning with his backhoe on a trailer. Roy showed him the exposed section of the buried machine. Dale stood at the bank and looked at it with the expression of a man who has seen a lot of things on farms across 40 years of operating equipment for hire and has learned not to be immediately surprised by any of them. He said it was going to be a careful pull. The machine had been in the bank long enough to be structurally part of it, and pulling too aggressively would likely separate the visible front section from whatever remained buried behind it. Roy said he understood. He said to take whatever time was needed. Dale worked carefully. He used the backhoe bucket to excavate around the exposed section first, freeing the front axle from the surrounding clay without direct force on the machine itself. What emerged as he worked, slowly, over the course of 3 hours, was more than Roy had expected. The machine was largely intact, not complete. The seat was gone, the steering wheel shaft had corroded through, the engine was obviously beyond any recovery. But the frame was in one piece. The rear axle was present. The 3-point hitch casting was recognizable, and on the right side of the hood, partially protected from the worst of the corrosion by its position against the bank, a section of the original red paint remained in an area perhaps 6 inches square, faded but present. It was a Massey Ferguson. The profile of the hood, the proportions of the frame, the design of the front axle casting. Roy had been around enough old equipment to read those things even through heavy corrosion. Specifically, given the size and the general configuration, it was one of the larger models from the late 1950s or early 1960s. An MF-65, he thought, though he was not certain. Dale got a chain on the rear axle and pulled the machine clear of the bank onto solid ground. Roy hosed it down with a garden hose to remove the surface mud. Then he found what he was looking for. The serial number plate, on the right side of the instrument panel housing, protected enough by its recessed position that the stamped numbers were legible after he worked the surface with a wire brush for 20 minutes. He wrote the number in his notebook. He was not sure, at first, what to do with it. The machine had been in his pond, in the pond of the property he had inherited from his uncle, for long enough that it had become part of the bank. It was on his land. Beyond that, he did not know what it was or how it had arrived there or when. His uncle had died in 2012. His uncle had purchased the property in 1983 from the family that had farmed it since the 1940s. Roy had no knowledge of the property's history before his uncle's purchase beyond what was in the abstract of title, which described land transfers and easements and did not describe tractors. He started with the County Historical Society, which maintained records of farm equipment registrations from the mid-20th century in an archive that a retired county clerk had organized and donated in the 1990s. He drove to the Historical Society on a Friday afternoon and described what he had found and provided the serial number. The volunteer archivist, a woman in her 70s who had grown up in the county and knew its agricultural history in the specific way that people who have never left a place know it, searched for 20 minutes and came back to the table where Roy was sitting with a folder and a look that Roy could not immediately interpret. The serial number corresponded to a Massey Ferguson 65 that had been registered in Jefferson County in 1959. The registered owner was a farming operation called Hendrick & Sons, located on Route 4, which Roy recognized as the road that ran along the north boundary of the property he now owned. The Hendrick farm had bordered his uncle's property, had bordered the property Roy had inherited on the north. The archivist showed him one more document, a report from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, dated September 14, 1971, documenting a stolen equipment complaint filed by one Harold Hendrick of Route 4. A Massey Ferguson 65, serial number matching the number in Roy's notebook, reported stolen from the Hendrick farm. The report noted that the machine had not been recovered. The case had been closed as unsolved in 1974, 3 years after the report was filed, with no recovery and no identified suspect. Roy sat with that folder for a long time. Harold Hendrick had died in 2001. Roy had known this because his uncle had mentioned it. The two men had been neighbors for nearly 20 years and had not been close, but had maintained the functional relationship that adjacent farm operations require. Harold Hendrick had a son. The son's name was Gerald Hendrick, and he was 67 years old, and he still lived in Jefferson County, on a different property than the one he had grown up on, but in the same county where his father had farmed, and where a Massey Ferguson 65 had been reported stolen in the autumn of 1971 and never found. Roy drove home and sat in his kitchen for a long time before he made any decision about what to do next. He was a methodical man. He had farmed for 41 years, which is a profession that rewards methodical thinking and punishes impulsive action. And the habits of mind it had built in him were not habits he set aside when the situation was personal rather than agricultural. He was sitting with information that was going to be significant to another man, a man he did not know well, whose father had lost a machine 50 years ago and had filed a report that was closed unsolved and presumably never thought about again after a certain point. The machine had been in a pond on the property adjacent to the Hendrick farm. The machine had been there since at least 1971, which was the year it was reported stolen, possibly earlier. Roy did not know how it had gotten there. He did not know who had put it there. He knew what the serial number said and what the stolen property report said, and what the geography of the situation implied, which was that a machine reported stolen from the Hendrick farm had been in a pond on the adjacent property for somewhere between 50 and 55 years. That was what the evidence showed. Everything else was inference. He called Gerald Hendrick on a Saturday morning. The conversation was careful on both sides, in the way that a conversation between two men who do not know each other well but are about to discuss something significant is always careful at the beginning. Roy said he had found something on his property in the course of draining a pond, and that he believed it was connected to the Hendrick family. Gerald asked what he had found. Roy described it plainly: the tractor, the recovery, the serial number, the historical society records, the stolen property report. He read Gerald the serial number from his notebook. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Roy said Gerald's name to confirm he was still there. Gerald said he was there. He said the serial number was right. He recognized it, or thought he did, because his father had kept the stolen property report in a folder in his desk, and Gerald had found it when he cleared the desk after his father died, and had kept it without being sure why. He said he would have to look at the folder to confirm the number exactly. Roy said he understood. Roy said Gerald was welcome to come and see the machine at any time. Gerald came on Sunday afternoon. He was a lean man, gray-haired, with the hands of someone who had done farm work for most of his life and had not entirely stopped. He drove a pickup that was clean but not new. He parked in Roy's yard, and Roy walked him out to the back 40, where the machine was sitting in the grass beside the drained pond, the excavated bank behind it still raw and wet, the pond basin below them reduced to a flat expanse of gray mud with a shallow channel of remaining water at the center where the pump continued to run. Gerald stood beside the machine for a long time without speaking. He walked around it once. He crouched at the serial number plate, which Roy had wire-brushed clean, and looked at it. He stood up. He looked at the pond basin. Then he said something that Roy had not expected. He said he thought he knew who had put it there. Roy waited. Gerald said there had been a farmhand his father had employed in the late 1960s and early 1970s, a man named Vernon Coates who had worked on the Hendrick farm for 4 years before leaving abruptly in the autumn of 1971. The same autumn, the tractor had been reported stolen. His father had suspected Vernon at the time and had said so to the sheriff's deputy who took the report. But suspicion was not evidence, and Vernon Coates had left the county before the investigation went anywhere, and the investigation had not gone far in any direction before it was closed. Harold Hendrick had believed for the rest of his life that Vernon Coates had stolen the machine. He had never been able to prove it and had eventually stopped talking about it, in the way that men stop talking about things they cannot resolve. What Gerald said next was the part that neither man had expected to be saying or hearing on a Sunday afternoon beside a drained pond in Jefferson County, Illinois. He said the property that Roy now owned, the property his uncle had purchased in 1983, had been sold in 1971 by a family named Aldrich. The Aldrich family had employed Vernon Coates as a part-time farmhand, in addition to the work he did for the Hendricks. Vernon Coates had worked both properties, he had known both farms, he had known the pond. Roy looked at the pond basin. He thought about the geography, the Hendrick farm to the north, the Aldrich property, his property, with its pond sitting in the back 40, close to the fence line between the two operations. A man who worked both farms would have known the pond, and would have known that a tractor driven into it in the right season, when the water was high and the banks were soft, would disappear. Not immediately, not cleanly, but eventually, over years and then decades, into the silt and the slumped bank until it was simply gone. Vernon Coates had never been found. Gerald's father had written a letter to the county sheriff in 1978, 7 years after the theft, asking whether any further investigation had been conducted. The sheriff had written back that the case remained open, but that no new evidence had emerged. Gerald had found that letter in the same folder as the stolen property report when he cleared his father's desk. Roy and Gerald stood beside the machine for a while without talking. The pump on the bank continued to run. The discharge continued to flow into the ditch. The pond continued to drain. Roy asked Gerald what he wanted to do about the tractor. Gerald looked at it for a moment. He said the machine was on Roy's property. Roy said the machine had come off Gerald's father's farm. Gerald said his father had been compensated by the farm insurance at the time of the theft. Not fully, but compensated. He said the machine was 50 years past any practical question of ownership. He said what he had come to see was whether it was real, and it was real, and he had seen it, and that was what he had needed. He said his father had talked about that tractor until the mid-1980s, and then had stopped. He said the stopping had always seemed to him like a decision rather than a forgetting, like his father had decided that talking about it was less useful than not talking about it and had made the switch and kept it. He said seeing the machine told him his father had been right about Vernon Coates, which was something his father had known and been unable to prove, and which Gerald found he cared about more than he would have predicted before this afternoon. Roy said he understood that. The two men walked back to Roy's yard. Gerald thanked him for calling. Roy said there was nothing else he could have done. Gerald said some people would have buried it again and said nothing. Roy said those people existed. He said he was not one of them. Gerald said he could see that. Gerald Hendrick drove home. Roy went back to the pond and checked the pump and noted the level in his notebook and confirmed the discharge was running cleanly. He looked at the Massey Ferguson 65 sitting in the grass beside the bank, its corroded frame orange against the green of the back 40, its 50 years in the water behind it, and nothing in front of it except whatever Roy decided to do next. He had not yet decided. The machine was not operable and would never be operable again. The engine alone was a loss, and the corrosion throughout the frame and the axle housings was structural rather than surface. What remained was not a tractor in any working sense. It was an object, an artifact. 50 years in a pond gives a piece of equipment a specific gravity, not the gravity of machinery, which is the gravity of function and economics and field performance, but a different gravity, harder to name and harder to dismiss. Roy cleaned it again with the garden hose. He wire-brushed the serial number plate until the numbers were as clear as they were going to get. He took photographs of the plate, of the remaining paint section on the hood, of the machine in full from 4 angles. He sent the photographs to Gerald Hendrick with a message saying they were his to keep. Gerald replied the following day. He said he appreciated it. He said his father would have appreciated it. He said if Roy ever got that pond restocked, he'd like to come fish it sometime. Roy said he planned to have it stocked by August. He said Gerald was welcome anytime. The Massey Ferguson 35 that Roy had paid $1,800 for at the Jefferson County farm sale was still running the pump on the south bank, 11 days without complaint. The hydraulics held. The PTO ran true. The engine produced the steady torque that old diesels produce when they have been built well and not abused beyond what they were built for. He had bought the machine to drain a pond. The pond was draining. That was what he had needed it to do, and it was doing it. And the fact that the draining had produced something he had not anticipated was not the machine's doing. The machine had simply run the pump. What the pump had uncovered was the pond's business, 50 years in the making, waiting with the patience that only submerged things possess for someone to lower the water far enough to see what was there. Roy had lowered the water. The mud had given up what it had been holding. Now the pond was emptying cleanly, the basin drying in the May sun, the far bank raw and open where the backhoe had worked. In a few weeks, Roy would bring in clean fill for the bank repair and crushed limestone for the basin floor, and in August, the fish supplier from Carbondale would back his tank truck to the bank and release 400 fingerling bass and 600 bluegill into fresh water, and the pond that had been dying for 30 years would begin again. The Massey Ferguson 65 would not be in it. Roy had decided that before Gerald had driven home. He had not decided what would become of it, but it would not go back into the water. Some things that come up from the mud are meant to stay up. This was one of them. It had been in that pond since 1971. It had kept its secret for 53 years. Harold Hendrick had gone to his grave knowing the machine was gone, but not knowing where it was. His son had lived 67 years with a stolen property report in a folder, and a father who had stopped talking about it somewhere in the 1980s. The Massey Ferguson 35 on the south bank ran on. Roy sat in his lawn chair with his coffee and his notebook and listened to the engine and the pump and the water moving through the discharge into the ditch, and thought about what it means to drain a pond that has been holding something for half a century, and whether the Massey Ferguson 35 he had bought for the job had been the right machine or simply the available one. He decided it didn't matter which. It had done the work.